Hi everyone, and welcome to today's session, which is called Closing the Chasm, Addressing the Gap Between Reporting and Prevalence of Bullying, Harassment and Sexual Misconduct. I'm Gemma McCall, the co-founder and CEO of Culture Shift. We're the organisation behind the widely adopted report and support system. For those of you who work with us, you'll know that we offer so much more than our award-winning anonymous reporting tool. We're proud to actively engage with our community through our in-person and online events and support ongoing learning and development through our dedicated training academy. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. I know how busy you all are, and the fact that you're all here says a lot about your commitment to creating safer, more supportive environments in higher education. So today's discussion is prompted by the recent Office for Students Sexual Misconduct Prevalence Survey, which has exposed a stark gap between what students experience and what gets officially reported. Today, we are going to unpack what that means, not just in terms of data, but in terms of trust, culture and responsibility. You'll hear from both myself and my colleague, Vicki Baars, who leads our culture transformation work here at Culture Shift. Morning, Vicki.
Hi, Gem.
And together we will explore what's driving that gap and, most importantly, what can be done about it. So if this is your first Culture Shift webinar or event, an extremely warm welcome to you. If you don't already work with Culture Shift and you're interested in learning more about our reporting system, you can book a demo with our team by clicking on the link that's being shared in the chat now. Culture Shift has been working to make safer, happier and more supportive places of work and study since 2016, and we've seen the sector's response to addressing harmful behaviours evolve in a huge way over that time. The Office for Students Sexual Misconduct Prevalence Survey, published in October, laid bare a striking truth. The fact that the prevalence of harassment and sexual misconduct remains high is no surprise, but only a fraction of those affected ever make a formal report. The survey showed that just 13.2% of students who'd experienced sexual misconduct came forward. That means that the vast majority are carrying that burden silently. On the day of publication, Jim Dickinson from Wonky pointed out two things in his analysis of the survey. First, that universities have sometimes been guilty of framing the new OFS regulations as a burden when the real burden rests on victim survivors. And second, the OFS data doesn't tell us enough about what happens after reporting. Do students feel heard? Do processes lead to change? That's where the real test of culture lies. Undoubtedly, this gap shows that there is still far too students either know how to or feel safe in telling their institution about their experiences. At Culture Shift, we've long argued that prevalence and reporting data must work hand in hand. Prevalence surveys reveal the scale of the harm. Reporting data tells us whether people trust their institution enough to speak up. And I would go so far as to say that we're obsessed about that gap between prevalence and reporting at Culture Shift, because it's where the culture of an organisation is most visible. If thousands are harmed, but only a handful feel able to tell their institution, what does that say about the confidence in the system? And what is the gap that we're actually prepared to accept? The experience of speaking up matters just as much as the act of doing it. If students and staff share their story and then have no understanding of what happens next, trust evaporates. What's the point in putting myself through this if nothing happens anyway, right? So closing that feedback loop is essential. That means publicly publishing your reported trend data, being transparent about what's been learned and showing the concrete steps taken as a result. Transparency isn't just compliance, it's culture change. It tells your community when you speak up, something will be done. And I think that when we start to acknowledge and do something about that, we will actually start to see significant change in changing the culture. So the OFS survey this year is the very first step in the right direction. However, we've come to understand here at Culture Shift that no university in the UK today understands what prevalence looks like across different types of harm. A small number of institutions understand prevalence in one particular area, which is useful, but we and the students in your care need consistency. We'll look more closely into what the statistics coming out of the OFS survey were, in a bit, but first I just wanted to reflect on what prevalence of sexual misconduct looks like globally. And although it's patchy, there has been some really interesting work globally that we can look to for comparison. So in Ireland, the Higher Education Authority's National Survey on Student and Staff Experiences of Sexual Violence and Harassment in Higher Education, snappy short title there, published in 2021, found that 29% of students had experienced sexual harassment and 14% had experienced sexual assault or violence during their time at university. Yet only 5% of those affected formally reported the incident to their higher education institution. That means 19 out of 20 students who experienced harm stayed silent. The HEA are planning on repeating this survey next year, and I think bringing that back round again and again to understand the changing picture of prevalence is really important. In Australia in 2021, Respect Now Always, led by Universities Australia, found that 16% of students had experienced sexual harassment in a university setting and 5% had experienced sexual assault. Only 6% of those who were sexually harassed and 9% of those who were sexually assaulted went on to make a formal report to their university. This was the second prevalence survey that was conducted by Universities Australia, and having done the first in 2016, and I know they've committed to running it again next year. And this long-term approach to understanding prevalence will definitely give that nation an excellent idea of the impact of the big investment that they have made into prevention. In Canada, the 2019 survey on individual safety in the post-secondary student population revealed that 11% of women students experienced sexual assault, while 71% of all students had witnessed or experienced unwanted sexualized behaviours on campus. Of those who were sexually assaulted, just 4% reporting it to their post-secondary institution, which is even fewer than Australia or Ireland. And finally, the United States. In 2019, the Association of American Universities Campus Climate Survey showed that 13% of students overall and more than 25% of undergrad women reported non-consensual sexual contact during their studies. Amongst those who experienced assault, only about 11% reported it to their university. So across every country, the pattern is clear. Prevalence remains high and reporting remains low. So this isn't unique to England, it's a global trust problem. Vicki, I'll hand over to you.
Thanks, Gemma. So I'm going to talk a bit more about understanding what we mean by prevalence. So prevalence is the concept of looking at and measuring a portion of something happening, the proportion of something happening in a given population. When we at Culture Shift are talking about prevalence, we're referring to the proportion of people's self-reporting an experience of bullying, harassment, sexual misconduct, or other forms of harm. Some people call prevalence surveys climate surveys, so that language is really interchangeable. You've heard Gemma using both today, and they do exist within the sector, but the OFS data is the newest and the largest we've ever seen across the UK. It's worth, before I go on, to kind of give a little bit of historical context around the fact that we don't have the longitudinal maturity that some of the other countries have. So some people were already doing surveys in 2016. We were only just acknowledging that this was a problem. We had the ZELIC guidelines in place up until then, which discouraged higher education institutions from investigating anything that could constitute a criminal offence. It meant we had a very hands-off approach to accepting that any of these types of behaviours were our responsibility internally within organisations. So nearly 10 years later, nearly all universities in higher education in the UK have some kind of approach to offering support, resolution, or prevention work. And so it's really important that we understand if those are making a difference. But measuring prevalence is not simple. But it is important. We need to understand what's happening in our context in order to understand if the things we're doing are changing that. Prevalence rates can be driven up by increased awareness and understanding, something all universities are doing in some small way, especially those who are regulated by the Office of Students, given the new expectations that come along with that regulation. Similarly, effective prevention initiatives should drive down your prevalence rates. So being able to understand that is important when thinking about this data. You really need a strong methodology when you're collecting prevalence data, and I would recommend, given that you're inside academic institutions, involving the academic community in doing that. One of the other things I have grave concerns about is prevalence league tables. They can be really dangerous for misrepresenting the information. The media are really responsible for this in terms of suggesting that just because people have higher prevalence numbers means they are doing a worse job at protecting their students. And that's not always the case. Like I said before, if you're doing a really good job of educating your students about what those behaviours mean, they're more likely to engage in prevalence survey data. They're more likely to tell you, because there is a causal effect there as well. Once you get into most prevalence data, it asks types of behaviour, but to get them to that form, usually you're using broad language that they have to identify with in the first place. I was on the Emoshi webinar last week around addressing sexual misconduct in higher education, and someone asked, is there any evidence of prevention work actually having an impact? Does it lower the rates of sexual misconduct? It was a really valid question, but it comes with the assumption that we might already know our existing rates of sexual misconduct and that we'd be able to measure a reduction and furthermore be able to demonstrate that prevention work was the cause of that reduction. Now, that's the dream. I think that's where evaluation should be, and I think that's where we should be aiming to get to in the sector. But I'm confident that most universities aren't currently in the position to do that. But we have to have a starting point. This kind of detailed evaluation is advanced, and it does require the underlying work, but it is possible. And demonstrating culture change over time is what we call generational. It's relatively early in a generational journey with only 10 years of really effective work happening in pockets in the UK. So we have a theory of change that we want to see a reduction in prevalence over time, and in line with that, a reduction in reporting. Now, we've used this graph now for a couple of years to demonstrate that reporting can fluctuate. And again, that can be influenced by educating people around the ability to report, what they can report, building trust in your organisation. But over time, we want to see both of those go down. We're never probably going to see them be completely on par, but we should see a drive down with all of the work that you're doing. And we have recently been speaking to our partners about what leading practice looks like in prevalence. So we consider having a good understanding of prevalence and how that compares to your reporting data to be leading practice in our maturity model, which I'm going to go into talk about a bit more detail. Ideally, be drawing on prevalence data within your own communities, but in the absence of that, you should be looking at a variety of other sources, and obviously the OFS data is a really good starting place for that. We're in the initial stages of developing a feature that allows you to do prevalence surveys, and we're collecting expressions of interest for that. So my colleague's going to pop a form in the chat if you were interested in being part of a pioneer programme to look at that feature. We'd be really keen to have you involved. That is a partner exclusive opportunity, unfortunately. But yeah, please do let us know if you are an existing partner, if you were interested in being part of that. And as part of the conversations around our maturity model, we've spoken to 33 of our partners and asked them if they know their prevalence rates. And this is what we found out. So majority of people have never known. It's not something that they've taken on and done yet. Around 30% of the people we asked said they had a plan in place to look at their prevalence. Around 12% felt confident that they knew their prevalence rates. And 2 of the people we spoke to have done prevalence or climate surveys in the past, but they're more than 3 years old. So that's a little bit of a look at what we mean by prevalence. Over to Gemma to talk about reporting.
So when we talk about reporting in this context, we're not just talking about numbers in a database. And I think it's really important to be clear about that. We're talking about people choosing to share deeply personal experience, often trauma, humiliation, or fear that they've experienced. And we're expecting them to report that to an institution. And they hope that that institution will take them seriously and care for them. But, you know, as we have been saying in this webinar, first of all, the word report gets bandied around an awful lot when we're having these conversations. And reporting itself can take many forms. You know, there's formal reporting, there's informal reporting, and I just have tried to kind of make sense in the following diagram, because I want to reflect on the different stages and moments that people can choose to tell someone. And I'm going to use the words tell someone to kind of start the demonstrating that journey. If we could just move to the next slide. And it starts with the harmful behaviour being experienced, and a huge majority of people will stay silent about that forever. And I've put the little kind of red dot there to demonstrate that that is a huge number of people that we will never earn the trust to hear what their experience is. And so we will never know and understand that. I would say that we have seen a trend over the time that we've been working with the sector, though, that often students stay silent until a particular trigger moment, and often that trigger moment can be at the end of their studies, because they fear so much about speaking up about it whilst they're in their studies, that they will tell the institution after, either a trigger moment after they've graduated or before they're about to graduate, so that they can try and stop that harmful behaviour happening again. So then the sort of next swathe of people, if you like, is the people that do tell someone. They tell a member of their family, a trusted friend, or a trusted member of the university staff who aren't in student support complaints or HR, who therefore might not be as familiar with the following processes as that. And I've marked that with a little red dot because there is also a large kind of population within our institutions who do that, who don't get kind of the right signposting to the next steps necessarily that we would want them to have. And we need to actively do something about that. So we need to be talking to family and signposting what wellbeing is available consistently and persistently, so that they know where to signpost. We also need to take control of our staff population and make sure that they know how to receive a disclosure, let's call it, and where to signpost next. So then I'm actually going to call a disclosure. I'm going to refer to that. That is when a record of the incident is made, and that can take a number of forms. That could be an anonymous report via report and support. It could be report with a name via report and support, or it could be reports directly to student services, wellbeing, or HR. Those people can then go off in kind of a couple of different directions. They can receive support, and that be that. Or they could decide to go and make a formal complaint whilst receiving support. Sometimes people can receive support, they kind of they're processing that traumatic experience, and then they might go on to make a formal complaint. But I think it's really important to try and map out this journey. And the two purple dots on that diagram there is, I'm going to maybe controversially say, the moments when senior leadership in an organisation start to care. They should start to care right at the beginning of the process and invest and work hard in giving you all the resources you need to encourage people to speak up and tell you about it. But only when it becomes formal does the attention really seem to go on things, because that is where the risk starts for the institution. So I just wanted to map that out. You know, the slides will be available afterwards, and I'm really interested to kind of discuss this going forward, if anyone's got any other input on it. Vicki?
Thanks, Gemma. Yeah, and if anyone's got any questions about any of this as we go through, by the way, like, please feel free to start putting them in the Q&A chat. We don't have to wait till the end to receive questions. But we will make sure we reserve some time to go through questions. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit about the reasons why things go unreported. And this is not comprehensive. This is just an initial kind of view over some of the reasons why, yeah, people might not come forward. Firstly, there's not thinking that something was serious enough. It's really common that we downplay our experiences of harmful behaviours. We see such extremes of violence in the media that we consume, and there's often with that a narrative that things like sexual assault only really happen if they're accompanied by additional violence. Consent education has worked well in higher education to increase a lot of people's awareness, but it's not reached everyone. And so not everyone knows things like any form of non-consensual sexual touching is a form of sexual assault. And so those people often won't speak up. Not knowing how or what to report, people might not see this subject as something that's appropriate to tell their university about. Interpersonal harm can feel really private and not something that they would feel that they would be believed, or that this would be the right place to take that information. And whilst most people have probably been signposted at some point to a code of conduct, they might have forgotten about that, and additional efforts need to be made to help people absorb and retain information about what is and isn't acceptable and what they can raise with their institution. Similarly, they might have received information about report and support or any other form of route avenue that people can take through onboarding or welcome week. And that's a really hugely overwhelming time for receiving information, and it cannot be the only time that you communicate about these reporting options. So that can be another reason why people might not know how to report. People might be trying to find information when they're in a live trauma response. Information overload is really common in this moment. And whilst we can Google or AI search, the information that we get back may not be reliable. And whilst OFS regulated universities have a duty to have a single source of information that's sufficiently prominent, we don't actually know, and we haven't really tested if that is resulting in people being able to access the information in a current state of stress or trauma. And so that's something to check and test in your own processes. Then there's confidence in institutional response. So we know that ineffective management of people's expectations really damages institutional trust. When organisations have a zero tolerance approach, it gives a message that if I report this, he'll be sacked. The reality is that that is an extremely high bar for people to meet and isn't always the outcome, even if someone does come forward and report. We don't recommend the use of zero tolerance language, open to questions on that one as well, but we believe it's a false promise to students. The reality is you should be using language that you take this seriously, that you will investigate, that action will be taken. But to say zero tolerance sets an expectation that their biggest ask will be met. And the reality is that employment law does not allow for that if we're talking about staff to student sexual misconduct, for example. Similarly, contract law for students means that, what happened might not reach a dismissal case. We also have to go through the processes of proving these things from happening. And so we have to be really careful what we're promising and what we're delivering actually go hand in hand and are a true reflection of what we're doing. And then ultimately, people might not ever feel ready to report, and that's something we have to accept. And that's why I don't think that gap will ever be entirely closed, and why our ambition is to get as close as possible. But it's okay, and it's empowering for people to choose not to engage in these processes. For some people, they can feel really punitive, and that might not be what they want for the person. They might just want the person to stop the behaviour. For others, it might just be that they just want to leave and move on with their lives. And so sometimes, we just have to accept that there may always be some kind of gap. Yeah, over to you, Gemma.
Definitely, thank you. So this was England's biggest ever national survey on sexual misconduct. Before the Hidden Marks report by NUS in 2010, we didn't have any indication of how often students were experiencing sexual harassment and violence. We still don't have the data on harassment by protected characteristics or bullying, stalking, and other forms of gender-based violence. So, even though I think it's fantastic that we have this data, we still don't have a full picture, and I think it's important to acknowledge that. It was attached to the National Student Survey, and we can discuss the pros and cons of this approach in a moment, but just over 50,000 students responded, and the response rate was 12.1%. 24.5% of responding final year students had experienced sexual harassment. 14.1% had experienced sexual assault or violence. 13.2% of those affected formally reported. So some of the more sort of specific findings from the survey, if we could just click the slide on, is that women were nearly 3 times more likely to experience sexual harassment than men. Women were more than twice as likely as men to experience sexual assault or violence. Nearly half of responding students who were lesbian, gay or bisexual had experienced sexual harassment, compared to 21.7% of heterosexual students. And LGBT students were more likely to have experienced sexual assault or violence. So that was at 29.8% compared to 12% of heterosexual students. Respondents with disabilities experienced harassment at 34.7%. and sexual assault or violence at 22.1%, both of those, both higher than those without disabilities. Those who were under 21 at the start of their course were also more likely to experience sexual harassment at 31.2%, and more likely to experience sexual assault or violence at 18.2%. I know I've just thrown an awful lot of statistics there, but what we're here to talk about today is the reporting gap, and only 13.2% of students who experienced an incident of sexual harassment in the last 12 months made a formal report or complaint about it to their university or college. So that's an 86.8% gap between prevalence and formal reporting. And for incidents of sexual assault or violence, 53.95% of respondents made a formal report or complaint to their university, indicating a 46.05% gap between prevalence and formal reporting. So the reporting gap is obviously, what we're focused on today, but I'm also really focused on the support seeking gap, because we also at Culture Shift acknowledge that going through a formal complaints process definitely is not necessarily the right thing that everyone should do or what everyone wants to do. And so we're really interested in the support seeking gap that exists. And 2/3 of students said that they don't know where to go for support, yet nearly a third, 2/3 of students say they know where to go for support, but nearly a third say that they didn't. And that third includes many of the people that we've just identified is most at risk. And given the intersectionality at play, this is where specialised support really becomes non-negotiable. Generic wellbeing services often don't meet the complex realities of survivors of sexual misconduct, and having trauma-informed, trained professionals, people who understand consent, power, identity, can help determine whether someone feels safe enough to speak up about their experience and whether they'll access support. Confidence is lowest amongst women who are LGBTQ+ and disabled students. So when students see evidence that their institution is investing in specialist expertise, it signals to them that they'll be met with understanding rather than bureaucracy. So although this is the biggest study in England to date, it was only open to third-year undergrad students, and these were self-selecting. And we would argue that this has limitations because some will have self-selected out due to past trauma. Others won't have taken part because they won't have necessarily labelled their own experiences of sexual misconduct of violence, which is kind of what Vicki was talking about earlier, about the sort of bar for reporting being high. The survey also limited experiences of sexual misconduct and violence when we know we need to understand all types of harm happening within our university communities. And so, it was limited, but it is a significant amount of data that we can definitely use to inform our work. But as Vicki mentioned earlier, we are opening the call for expressions of interest to take part in a more detailed prevalence survey pilot for all students, so that it wouldn't be restricted to certain year groups. And we will be basing the questions on the 2024 OFS pilot survey questions to make that consistent. So if you'd be interested in that, then please do put your name down. It is only open to customers of Culture Shift.
Thanks, Gemma. So as I mentioned before, Culture Shift has been working on a maturity model. We've designed this framework to help organisations to evaluate their culture management strategy and make more meaningful interventions. Whether your organisation is just at the beginning to understand what behaviours you might need to address, or you're far along at leading practice, we hope that this framework gives you the opportunity to see where you might be and what challenges, risks, and opportunities there are for you moving forward. So there are 8 stages that we take people through, and they range from demonstrating leading practice and include also a category of relapse, because we know some organisations make progress and then stall. We also know that we're in a really challenging financial climate at the moment, and that has a really big impact on doing this work effectively. But each of the stages, we hope, helps people to reflect on prioritisation, resource allocation, and what they're doing in order to make a difference. So as I take you through these, see if there's any sort of things that chime for you. Whilst we look at this holistically, and we'll give you an ultimate stage through our evaluations, there might be that some things you're doing at certain stages and other things you're doing at others. So the first stage is around, we call pre-contemplation. This, hopefully no one on the call is here because this is organisations who are unaware they have an issue. If you're here, you probably have some kind of awareness that you've got this issue going on in your organisation. They're unlikely to know their prevalence rates, and they're probably dealing with complex late-stage complaints and grievances. And there's risks around legal damages and reputation. When it comes to the next stage, contemplation, this is where awareness starts to come in. You've got some concerns, but you're still unlikely to know your prevalence. You're probably receiving some reports, but not in a consistent way. They're probably festering and not coming forward until they're really bad and really complex, and a lot needs to be unpacked. And again, this can be a risk around legal challenges and reputation. The next stage is determination. So this is where people have an intention to act. This is usually where people start to contact us and work with us. They've maybe put some training in place or done some process improvements, but still unlikely to know their prevalence, but might be getting more reports through demonstrating the need to address an issue. Some of these cases might still be complex and taking a long time, and they might lack coordination, and people might be a bit unhappy with the outcome of the process, but stuff is being done. There is an intention to work here. Then the next stage that we define is action. This is where you have plans in place to deliver initiatives, which can range from training to process improvements, and you probably have plans to find out your prevalence. This can be, the challenges here can be a lack of awareness around what acceptable behaviours are, that you might not have educated your community well at this stage because you're still in early implementation. But the opportunities are that there's lots of room for improvement, and taking a whole institutional approach is a really great way to do that. The next stage is maintenance. So here is where we assess people to have been implementing initiatives for more than 12 months, but perhaps progress has plateaued a little bit. You've not been able to maybe complete everything on your action list. The challenges are usually resource limitation, work is in silos, it's maybe delivered just by one team, and that can kind of decline trust in the organisation. An opportunity here is that this is the perfect moment to find out your prevalence, to sort of renew interest. Then we've got promising practice. Here we are seeing reporting rates increase, probably anonymous reporting going down, which is for us an indicator of increase in trust. So when people first launch with our platform, we often see a higher number of anonymous reports because people aren't sure that they want to come forward with their name. And over time, we see an indicator of positive indicator is when those anonymous reports sort of drop below the named reports that you're getting through. You maybe have some prevalence data, you might be looking at your OFS data, you might ask a question in your staff surveys, but you might still have perhaps a limited budget, or the data is not very mature yet in order to do any kind of evaluation of your successes. But your opportunity is that over time you can use that data to evaluate the success of your initiatives. And for those in leading practice, they can demonstrate that they are doing sustained improvements and able to measure outcomes. They're sharing their data widely, which Gemma mentioned already, and publicly publishing it. We really value this. We believe that closes the feedback loop to students who are reporting. They get to see what's being done as a result of their reports, and it helps to make improvements in the process in the future going forward. Some of the challenges is you might have more ideas than you have time to implement. People at this stage usually are seeking ideas and wanting to do loads and have a huge action plan. And sometimes, resources might not grow in line with that, but it's all kind of great stuff. And one of the opportunities is sharing successes back with the rest of the community doing this work and being able to be seen as leading practice. Universities love that for their reputation. So that's a definite positive outcome. We also define a stage called relapse. This is where previous initiatives have stalled or stopped completely. You might have previously known your data, it might be like 3 or 5 years old, and there's no intention to repeat it. Usually when we see people at this stage, there's been a change in leadership, there's been a loss of key personnel who are delivering the work and they haven't been replaced. And that's really worrisome. But there is an opportunity here is that you're not starting from scratch. There has been groundwork in the past, and you aren't in the same place of people who are sort of in pre-contemplation or contemplation. There is a risk here, though, that the culture gets worse, and that you're not doing what you say you will. You might have policies that say you'll deliver something and you've lost the people who are doing that work. So you're in a real risky position for legal challenges and reputational damage. So how we assess stages, we offer 3 types of assessment to see where you are on our culture our maturity model. So first one is change readiness. So this is with organisations who aren't customers. We run something called a culture clinic. This gives you an opportunity to discuss with us what you're currently doing and helps us determine where we think you are on that journey. Then when customers first join us and they're onboarding and they're launching their platform, we do an implementation evaluation, and we kind of track what actions you're hoping to take and give advice and guidance on how to really boost the beginning of your culture change journey. And then those who've been customers with us for more than 12 months can access a annual impact evaluation. And for this, we go through 6 themes that you can see on the screen there. And this is done by your customer success manager. And so they have reached out to key contacts. But if you're not a key contact and you don't know who your customer success manager is, then we will be reaching out to everyone who attends this call. So you will hear from them. So if you don't know who they are currently, you will know them hopefully in the next few days. And they can offer that for you. And as we used the data earlier, we've done that assessment with 33 of our partners so far, and it's been really amazing to see the challenges and the successes that people are having in various different areas. Over to you, Gemma.
Thanks. I'm just going to address something that has been mentioned in the chat, which is whether we are going to kind of offer badges, if you like, for impact evaluations. At this point, we've decided not to do that because we think that you are all quite overwhelmed with charter marks and the investment of time and everything in that. So what we're trying to do with the impact evaluations is give you a accessible, not too time-consuming way to assess where you are on that kind of culture transformation journey or that maturity model, so that you can then have those conversations with your senior leadership teams and know where the action needs to be taken. We have debated it a lot as to whether we should kind of make it a charter mark or kind of give a kind of badge. And I know that universities love having them, but we also don't want to put the burden of time on a time-starved kind of group of people who are trying to make progress and take action.
Yeah, totally agree. Totally agree, Gemma. And I think to make it a charter mark, we would require a lot more evidence of the things you say you're doing and be able to verify that. And I think that would be more time consuming for us and especially for you, having been involved in charter marks like the Race Equality Charter Mark and Athena Swan. Those self-assessment processes are amazing. They're so thorough, but they are very time consuming. And so I chose not to go down that route when we set up the maturity model for now. Who knows where it might evolve in the future, but we just thought it was more important to give have an opportunity to have those conversations and get that steer from us in a more discreet way. So yeah, whilst we're looking at the data holistically, we'll never publish these universities are at these stages.
Yeah, definitely.
Or no, I say never, not currently.
Not currently, yeah. So I just want to talk a moment about budget, and I'm going to kind of reference our good friends Clarissa DeSantis and Graham Towell, who make the point really powerfully that universities often say they're committed to tackling sexual harassment and violence, yet allocate barely enough resource to manage the fallout and not to prevent the harm. The budget isn't just an operational tool, it's a public statement of what matters most to you. And too often funding sits entirely on the reactive side, on investigations, on case management. But if the money is going into response, then you are all permanently firefighting. So prevention needs equal weight. It means resourcing, campaigns, training, bystander programs, and most crucially, specialist roles. I'm going to keep banging the drum for that, but we need the people who can support the ever increasing complex needs that these cases are bringing to our doors. You know, part of this investment has to go to prevention rather than response. And I think collecting prevalence data, analysing trends and publishing progress reports are the things that we should be doing, but we then have to invest in action. And so the OFS obviously in E6 is now making it clear that providers must have the capacity and resource to prevent and address harassment and sexual misconduct. But you can only do that if you also are funding measurement and evaluation of your work. Being as transparent as possible will build that trust within your population, and that will drive reporting, and it all kind of, you know, feeds into that. As part of the impact evaluations that we were mentioning earlier, we have asked about budget and resource as part of these. And interestingly, as you can see from this diagram, there are too many budgets that are either staying the same, even though issues are increasing and becoming more complex to handle, or they're being cut. Work is being funded well in some institutions, but we have to make sure that the financial pressures on the sector do not mean that this work stops being adequately funded. And we also have to make absolutely sure that E6 is not seen as just a minimum standard, and that we have inadvertently set a low bar for us to reach. We have to be going on beyond that minimum standard and investing in this work.
Yeah, thanks, Gemma. So one easy way that we think you can increase reporting rates is through improving your communication and campaigns efforts. You should be communicating with your students and staff frequently and in ways that will, you know, meet their needs, and in a variety of different ways. We have had so many partners do what we call a soft launch of their report and support platforms. And often this is driven by fear that they'll be inundated with reports. So they've wanted to sort of gently introduce the platform and gradually promote it over time. Sometimes that's meant that they've never promoted it again after that point, and we've seen reporting numbers be woefully inadequate compared to what they should have been expecting. You just have to communicate about these things regularly. Like, messages don't go in as a one-off, and they have to be sustained and varied, and talk to people about the things that meet their needs and their interests. There are different ways that you can do this. So I like to distinguish between what we call awareness and behaviour change campaigns. So the two different approaches, really. The first is about campaigns that are promotional. They're about letting people know what behaviours are unacceptable, where they can report them, and how they can access support. This is the most common type of campaign we see. And our promoting your platform campaign is available to all Culture Shift partners, whatever package you're on. And it includes a variety of editable assets that are quick and easy to download. Add your organisational information, your specific URL for your reporting site, and use it to promote the site. And we've seen some people using that. We've got lots of kind of communications about that from people recently, which is really exciting. However, our other campaigns are designed to help encourage behaviour change over time. So our active bystander and our allyship campaigns are examples of this. They should be implemented over a series of weeks or months to sustain the message and to encourage people to take those bystander interventions or to demonstrate more effective allyship. And so those are more detailed, more complex campaigns. They come with more copy, and they say week 1 send this, week 2 send that, and they give you a real clear demonstrated way to approach it. Our campaigns are off the shelf, ready to use. They require minimal effort for you to edit and update them. So you can see here that with this poster here around our preventing sexual harassment campaign, the different elements that you can change. So you can change the QR code, the URL, the byline, the copy. You can really make it your own, or you can just keep it exactly what you are and just put your own URL in there and leave it at that. You can really do as much or as little as you want with these campaigns, and they come in a variety of different formats as well for you to use, including like TV screens, email, social media. It comes with an implementation guide and a technical guide. So if people are editing it, you can edit it through design software if you're working with a marketing team, say, or if you're not working with your marketing team and it's coming from a team that don't have that technical capability. We've now moved almost all of our campaigns into Canva. So you can use Canva templates. So you don't have to have a Canva account. I think you actually do have to have one, but they can be the free account. And you can change those in there. And the implementation guides give you loads of advice and guidance about how to implement these campaigns. So they're a hugely beneficial part of being a partner of Culture Shift. And we really love seeing when people utilize them. It fills our heart with joy when we get pictures of people kind of who've edited and used the campaigns and put them up. So if you are existing partners who already use them, please do send in those photos because that makes us very happy. I think we're going to go over to Q&A now, Gemma, is that right?
Yeah, we will. They are available in Welsh, Venice, just to confirm that. So we're going to go over to Q&A. Thank you so much for, being so active in the chat and in the Q&A. That's really great to see. I'm going to come on to one of the questions that I'm keen for us to explore and discuss is how much do we think the freedom of speech piece is impacting both prevalence and response and the trust issues we see playing out? For example, i.e. the level of tolerance and how we respond and the ripple effect. Obviously, free speech kind of comes into our discussions an awful lot here at Culture Shift. So this is kind of why I've prioritised this as a question to answer. Vicki, do you want to share an opinion on how much we think it's impacting prevalence and response?
Yeah, we have concerns that it is starting to impact people's ability to speak up, partly because there's conflict in the law where free speech says that offensive language is acceptable. The definition in the Equality Act of harassment uses the term causing offence. So there's a direct conflict in those two pieces of legislation, and freedom of speech, I think it's about like the language that the Office of Students use quite a lot in their guidance around this is like not having a chilling effect. And where we really trust the partners that we work with is how you have a proportionate response to these things. So if someone is saying something that's within their right to say, but it still is hurting other people, they're probably not going to go down a formal disciplinary of any kind, but you probably are going to offer some kind of support to that individual. And that's proportionality. So the chilling effect would be if the person felt that because they said that thing, they were going to get punished in some way. And actually, it's about our responses being really clear that the person who has experienced it can still have experienced that as a form of harm or a form of hurt, but they still have a right to access support and feel that harm and hurt, but it doesn't necessarily mean that there's going to be any negative consequences for the individual who said it. So it's a real nuance that I think we haven't got across to our student and staff communities yet, about where that line sits. We've put some guidance together where we actually recommend that people do have information on their report and support platforms around what may constitute sort of free speech, but also be hurtful, and how people can encourage them to still come forward for support, but how, people have a right to say those things and can't expect there to be. It's that thing I was saying before about a zero tolerance approach. It's not true if you have to have a proportionate response. So yeah, we've actually got some sessions on this coming up at our annual conference in March. I'm really excited about because some of the speakers we're talking to about potentially being on those panels. So we've got one about conflicting rights in law and one about free speech and where it becomes hate speech and how do you draw that line. So yeah, if you're interested in hearing more, we've got whole 45-minute long sessions on that at conference, so please do come along.
Yeah, definitely. It's something that you are handling and having to balance, and we will not stop talking about it ever, I don't think. But it's obviously very upsetting to think that it could be impacting people's ability to speak up about harm that they've experienced. So it's something that we need to keep talking about and need to get right. Going to move to another question now, which was asked sort of quite early doors when we were talking about the definitions around sort of what reporting is. And the question is the language of a report being more informal versus a disclosure, which results in a formal record, a nationally recognised distinction, or do many organisations use variations of this language and this distinction is culture shift's preference? To be clear, that's culture shift's preference. We are trying to bring clarity to an area where words have been used interchangeably, and we need to start being clear about the terminology in this area. The fact is that disclosure is a very sort of let's call it an institutional word. So when someone is receiving information, they term it a disclosure. Talking about disclosures to people who've experienced harm kind of is a little bit meaningless because they don't really necessarily know what a disclosure means. So that's why we use the kind of that language at the beginning, because that is what someone understands. They understand that they have experienced harm and that they have told someone about it. We need to now clarify our terminology once that action is taken by the person who's experienced or witnessed the harm. So I think we probably need to talk more about that in future conversations. But yeah, no, it's not nationally recognised. We've developed that. That's a fancy word for saying we thought of it in the last few days when we've been talking about it, because there's a training course that's going to be available in the training academy for receiving disclosures, and so we really want to get our terminology around that correct. Have you got anything to add to that at all, Vicki?
No, that training is available to book on already. So just to add to that, I don't know if any colleagues can share a link to that, but that would be amazing if you can. If not, we've got links on our online community network, which we're going to share in a bit. But yeah, I think you're right, like the language is really inward looking. It doesn't really necessarily chime with victim survivors, this concept of a disclosure. We're really focused as people who are running the processes on what is a first disclosure, what does that mean? And also the OFS regulations require all students to know, all members of staff to know what to do if someone discloses to them. So that language is really clear in terms of process, but like you say, that language doesn't really mean much to students. And also we've found over time, some people use report and support as a disclosure tool. So they use it very at the informal end, you can't raise a formal report through that process. It's very much just about speaking up and getting support, whereas others use it more as what we would traditionally think of as a reporting tool, which includes everything from initially disclosing to being able to raise a grievance by ticking certain things in that form and asking for certain things and speaking to like that, routing to specific teams like complaints and appeals and HR. So yeah, this language is so interchangeably used, but we are, like I say, we're really trying to kind of use that language of like when someone tells someone something, because that's a moment of trust, and that's a really pivotal moment of that person in how they will heal from their experience.
Yeah, 100%. There's a kind of question / observation next, which I'm interested to get your feedback on, Vicki. So someone said, even in cases where students do not wish to inform the police, is anyone, e.g. the police, Home Office, National Crime Statistics, etc., asking universities for this data on prevalence? I find it very concerning that this data just sits within universities and does not contribute at all to national statistics regarding prevalence of these types of harm. Now, the Office for Students is obviously a governmental department, and so that prevalence data of that national survey is with them. And I know in E6, actually, how have they talked about understanding prevalence versus reporting in E6? I can't quite recall.
I don't think they've got into the interconnectedness between it. There's definitely conversations about needing clear reporting pathways, and there's definitely information in there about knowing your prevalence, and I think there's a line around, if you have more prevalence, you may be expected to be doing more to address that prevalence. It's very their inclusion of concept of prevalence is very loose. Reporting is clearer in that it's like you need clear reporting routes, and students and staff need to know about them. I don't think they've talked about the interconnectedness of them.
Yeah. And that, I think, now that sort of E6 is regulation, that's the kind of clarity and guidance that we need going forward about kind of what happens next.
To come back about like data sharing though, we very much promote publicly publishing. So those prevalence rates, your reporting figures, like in aggregate, each year, like in an annual report, we really recommend publishing that data, and sharing it with your local like police commissioners and stuff is a really good idea. To feed that loop back in. They are often sharing it with you, and I think it makes sense to share it in both directions. What a word of caution I would have is about sharing individual incidents with the police without like due consideration, and your legal teams will probably have a very strong opinion on sort of the case by case basis in which you do that. But in terms of aggregate data, like, yeah, share and share away. I think it's really good for that to be collectively used.
Yeah, 100%. I'm really aware of time, so I'm going to wrap up today's discussion, but I do just want to leave you with a few thoughts about where we go from here. If we want to understand what's really happening in our institutions, we can't rely on limited national data sets or formal reports. We need to start doing whole community prevalence surveys, not just amongst final year students, not just every few years, but across all students and staff regularly. Someone in the chat quite rightly talked about how staff are experiencing harassment and violence from students, and we definitely need to understand that much better. Staff reporting is very low, like through our systems, and so arguably we have to work harder to earn trust there, than in other places. But we need to get a true picture of what's working and where trust still needs to be built. And then crucially, as I said before, we have to invest in this work. If we want to see prevalence go down and reporting go up, then we have to resource prevention, response and support properly. And we know that that isn't simple, and underinvestment doesn't just slow down progress. It signals to survivors and staff that it just isn't really a priority. So for those already working with us, this conversation won't end here. It'll be continuing in our online community network, and we'll always be digging deeper into how institutions can measure, resource and sustain meaningful progress. For those who don't currently work with Culture Shift, we would love to work with you. So please book in a conversation with us about that. And it just leaves me to say thank you so much for joining us today. This conversation won't end. It'll be something that we kind of keep talking about and keep obsessing about, closing that gap. And I'm really delighted that you guys are here to help with the collective effort to close the chasm between prevalence and reporting.